more kids than yesterday, but
They-
during the holiday.
They did actually. As a matter of fact, it was everyone showed except for one young man. Apparently had some eye issues. So, and we're hoping that he shows up tomorrow because he's supposed to be bringing me lunch for the missionary. So we'll see what happens there. So yeah, I think it'll be fine. Other than that, actually pretty good turnout last night too.
Good.
So
Good.
it was alright.
Yeah.
We got about 5 minutes left. I mean, it's supposed to start at 7:15. That's like
Yeah,
text that
right.
moment, so we'll see. But Jerry Jenkins said he was coming. I saw he was at benediction. I don't know where he went.
He might be talking to the rosary group outside. You know,
Who was he,
Larry's
Drake?
98 years old.
Larry
Sheldon, who prays the rosary with them, comes up really
Oh,
shuffles as he
yeah. Wow.
I
Well, who's it?
know.
Bill Miller. He's like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, it's good. Let's talk longevity in the parrot, I guess.
Rosemary Mizuko, I don't know how old. I know she's in her 90s.
Well, she had.
She did?
Rosemary Zuko?
Mazzola.
Mazzola. I thought you said
Mazzola.
Mazuka.
Sorry.
Okay, yeah.
Mazzola.
Oh, actually, I had her female.
No. Yeah. Mary Lowy. I saw her. I was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. I mean, I know she would come to the early masses. Yeah, that's kind of a shock that happened. I mean, she was older, but like the way born without sin. And what's interesting is I never heard of that, and so I did some research on it. There's nothing definitively taught by the church. However, the first time this is actually kind of posited as the presence of Jesus, Mary, and Mary, and in that action, John was sanctified in the womb, where he was born without sin. So not conceived without sin, but born without sin. And the first theologian really posits this is none other than St. Thomas Aquinas in the third part of the Summa Theologiae, question 27, article 6. He kind of handles that question, and his rationale is such that Scripture is very clear about that, but also it makes more sense, it's more fitting that John the Baptist would be born without sin because that's a higher glorification of God and also gives hope to mankind, which is sort of like the mission of all of us, including John the Baptist, in a very particular way. That's not to say that, or not to diminish anything about John the Baptist or any other saint, or even the Virgin Mary, or Jesus himself, but he concluded that was the case. However, the church has never actually made a definitive teaching saying that actually can be held, although the church never said anything that it can't be held. So, in other words, it's one of those kind of open questions where you can either believe it or not. There's really no, Catholic's good faith can actually hold it to be true or not true. It really does not make much of a difference according to your belief or your faith or anything else like that. So, if anything, it adds to it, which is, I think, another reason why Thomas Aquinas would agree that actually it truly did happen. So, whatever, either way you can hold it. So it works out. That was a very good question. It's something I never heard before, so I'm happy it was brought up. So, excellent. So tonight, in this July edition of Friends Food Faith, is the first Tuesday. The format changed a little bit from Bother the Father. We have more of a topical discussion rather than kind of an open forum. And tonight we're going to talk about the role of church and what her thoughts are on forms of government, how the church interacts with government, how the church interacts with the state. And so it's important to start with an understanding of what does the church understand to be a valid form of government. A valid form of government has jurisdiction within secular authority, right, with over a certain area. And that authority is also given to them by God, the church would actually say. And they're called to use that authority always for the good of the people they're serving. So in other words, the church say that a valid form of government is one that is just, meaning one that it gives to the people what they are due, one that upholds the good of the people that under their jurisdiction, and also is guided by morals, ethics, primarily also listens to the church. So the church also recognizes that there are certain realms that the church really doesn't have a say in, particularly maybe prudence or practical issues But the church would say that there's certain morals and ethics and guidelines that everyone should be following to reach certain ends. And maybe how one reaches those ends are kind of where the secular government would come into play. So first, I'll start with maybe a little bit of history lessons. So we hear this this concept in the United States about separation of church and state. And that was not something that was just developed in 1777, 1778 by Thomas Jefferson in a letter to a Baptist congregation who kind of asked the question about, well, where is that line between church and state, right? The First Amendment gives us the freedom to worship, the freedom to assemble. So does that mean it's unlimited? Does that mean that the church then has some precedence over the government, the federal government? And Thomas Jefferson really wrote back to this congregation saying, there's sort of like a wall, right? Nowhere in the Constitution, nowhere in the Declaration of Independence, nowhere other than those letters from Thomas Jefferson, you actually find that statement. But that was not something that just came from the mind of Thomas Jefferson. The church, since about the 5th century, has always held the separation of church and state. And even before that, around the 4th century, it was the kind of seedlings of that were already kind of planted and started to take root. And it really came to the Council of Nicaea. So the Council of Nicaea, which has happened in 325, was the second ecumenical council. The first one being the one in Jerusalem, where they settled the question about circumcision and eating of unclean animals and all this good stuff, right? But the second ecumenical council of Nicaea was called, and it was called because shortly before that, in 313 and 315, the Christianity was recognized as a valid religion. It wasn't the religion of the realm of the Roman Empire, but it was actually at that point by Constantine was declared one that could be practiced legally within the Roman Empire. And of course, Constantine eventually converted and became Christian on his deathbed. At least that's how legend goes. Some people think otherwise. Who knows? But the important thing was that Constantine, after the Christianity became a recognized religion, he and his mother was a Christian, Helen. There were a lot of these issues going on that needed answers. And he took it upon himself as the role of the emperor to call all these bishops together and try to get an answer in this ecumenical council. Well, right away, there were some kind of problems with that, the fact that you have a secular authority, someone that's not been ordained, to call together a council that is really at the realm of the church, right? And is ordained ministers and even the faith, of course, can have input on that, but it's the ordained ministers who really have the authority within that council. So it was true that Constantine did call them together, but really that's where Constantine's kind of let it go. He did kind of let the council play out. He didn't really have much of an input on it. He was just trying to find answers to actually make sure that his empire was still together, right? Because these ideas that were put out there were causing schisms, causing problems. And it's pretty important also to even go back farther, that before this happened, there was an intimate relation between a religion and government. At any time before history, whether you talk about the Greeks, the Romans, even the Israelites, and even the other regions around the Mediterranean, there was always this invisible line between the religion of the realm and the authority of the realm. That oftentimes, whoever the emperor, the king, whoever was also the religious authority for those people too. King David. David was considered a religious authority. We recall in the book of Samuel, when he was running away from Saul, he ate of the altar bread, which could only be eaten by the priestly people, right? Moses was of the line of Levi, right? He was a priestly person. Aaron, of course, being a high priest. These were rulers of the people. And that kind of, again, promulgated all the way through, going back to Abraham, going back to Moses, all the way through the time of the day, and other non-Israelite or non-Hebrew or non-Christian states had their own religion that was associated with the state too. So in other words, to break a law was not only breaking the law of the king, it was also breaking the law of God or the gods or whoever it may be, right? So you're offending two parties when you actually break one of those laws. Now, when Christianity became legal, there was kind of a shift in that. That, well, the church doesn't have any secular authority. They're not kings, right? They're not rulers. They're not lords. They're these men that were ordained for a particular reason to shepherd these people in a spiritual way and actually take responsibility for the spiritual welfare of the people that they had jurisdiction over. And that was different than an emperor or a king, where they had more to protect people from, like, maybe or gather taxes to actually, like, build roads or all these other practical things you would see in society. So almost right away, you see this kind of distinction between what the role of the emperor was and what the role of the pope was. So Constantine said, we need to get everyone together. The pope did agree. They gathered all the bishops around the world, and they had this council. And then at that point, Constantine just kind of stepped back and let things happen. He recognized that, okay, this is now out of my realm. This is the realm of God. The ordained priest and the pope has this. And then we will follow suit based on what they decide. And that's pretty much what happened. The earliest writing we see where this actually takes kind of some blossoming actually comes about 150 years later, in the 5th century, around 483. And this was actually written from Pope Felix II, or the third, depending on which one you look at, to Emperor Zeno, who was the Roman emperor at the time. So this is kind of about 200 years or so before the fall of Rome. And he writes to this monarch, since the freedom of any embassy whatsoever is always regarded as sacrosanct by the law of nations, even among nations that are barbarian and ignorant of the deity, even in conducting human affairs, everyone knows that it must, for all the more reason, be held unassailed, especially in divine matters, by a Roman emperor and a Christian ruler. So what he's basically telling the emperor here is that, look, you have your world, you have your authority, and we have ours. That just how we recognize other embassies, like in our region, right, from other nations, they have sovereignty. It should be the same way with the church. The church is not ruled by the emperor. The church has its own autonomy, its own laws, its own rules, and therefore should give even leeway as far as implementing those rules, running those rules within their proper jurisdiction. So, of course,
483.
This was 483, right? So, so from that, though, I mean, so we see the first kind of like, this is the first time we see everything written about this understanding between the church and state. And then from then on, there's these other questions that rise from it. So, okay, wait a minute now. What does that mean then? So we have this law, we have this authority. When it comes to, let's say we have a war with another nation, right? How do we figure that out? And this was already kind of established before that with Augustine, before this kind of writing, but also shortly after the Nicene Council about, okay, just war, right? How does secular authority be justified in waging war, not necessarily waging war, but defending themselves within war? That's really the main drive when it comes to war, that you can't be an unjust aggressor when it comes to war. So in other words, the Roman Empire just can't go into, let's say, I don't know, Zaire, and just take it over because they want to. There has to be some kind of attack on Rome from Zaire where they're defending their people, defending their sovereignty as a state.
Does that go along with the
Right.
get the land back because it was taken from us to begin with?
Yes, and I think, and here there's other criteria within that. This is all developed by Augustine, Saint Augustine, and there's criteria that like parabellum and bello, and then antebellum parabello, right? So in other words, before war, leading up to that, and then within war. So some of this criteria would be like, okay, so first off, leading up to this war, you cannot be the unjust aggressor. You can't be the one attacking. You're the one defending. Even within that, though, it has to be the last resort, right? You've tried everything else to try to settle this reasonably. And one thing you recognize too, Augustine always would say, and so would all the other theologians in the church, that war is always a failure of human communication and human dignity, right? But because we live in a fallen world, how do we justify ourselves then by defending ourselves and maybe even taking life within that, right? So again, it has to be, I can't be the unjust aggressor. It has to be the proper authority, right? So the people that are in charge of the people making these calls. And I also within that, I can't necessarily it has to be like very last resort and actually this communication breakdown. Then even within war, there's certain things like you can't target non-combatants, right? You can't target citizens. You have to use like proportional amount of force to overcome the threat. So in other words, like let's say back there in Roman times, if you have a Roman legion that are charging with swords, but the other people have gunpowder, well, that's kind of a disproportionate force in order to overcome it, right? So swords would be swords, or skill, whatever it may be, or maybe a better analogy would be totally appropriate and proportional if I have a machete and then someone has a nuclear weapon. Okay, so that's a completely unproportional amount of force, right, to overcome this machete that's coming at me, right? And so that's the other thing too, and this limiting of casualties. That's always kind of like the main drive behind within it. So the church has developed these doctrines, these kind of thoughts on how these things should happen to inform and maybe guide the secular authorities in their rule, and how to maybe practically put these Christian thoughts, these religious concepts into practice. But also not just religious concepts, but like just reasonable concepts, right? So a lot of the stuff isn't really necessarily based on theology. It's really more based on philosophy and reason.
Yes.
Right, justice. So that's kind of where it starts kind of getting a little more clear on what the role of the church is, what the role of the secular authority is. Primarily, you kind of see this more than throughout history when it comes to capital punishment. So, in other words, for a long time, there was question, the church is for life, it's for human dignity. So what happens if you have this maniac or this person who can't control themselves and is a menace to society, right? Well, based on the circumstance you find yourself in, maybe we can't put this person in a prison or a cell because they're a super mastermind. They have this ability to just kind of escape, and they don't really have any moral compass to where they can actually just go out and do this. Maybe no fault of their own, but maybe it is, how do we kind of protect society from these type of people, and also be dignified and charitable and uphold justice as well? And so Thomas Aquinas even would state that in certain circumstances, the death penalty is justified. For those circumstances, of course. But also, he looked at capital punishment as a means of conversion. That when someone is actually faced with their own mortality, that's kind of a catalyst for someone to turn back to God, right? When, especially if they have no control over that mortality, or no control of when they actually die. Now, some critics will say, well, based on Thomas Aquinas' time, that may be true, right? If you have the wooden cage you're putting people in and they can, burn it or whatever, well, okay, yeah, maybe that's our last resort, is maybe pull out capital punishment. As we see today, and this was really written by John Paul II, and now it's been kind of even taken further and developed more by Pope Francis. There really, maybe in today's society, virtually no circumstance where the death penalty would be warranted, right? So we see a development of doctrinal. But again, this is still kind of the church helping to inform the secular authority and how to implement morals and ethics. But it's still for the secular authority to do that, right? And so then we start getting maybe a little bit, also a little bit more discombobulated as we go through time, where, all through up to about the 16th century, there was this intimate relationship between the church and the state. All right, before we go through that, maybe it's best to go back a little bit further. So maybe around the 8th century, that's when we started having the fall of the Roman Empire, right? So Rome was a very vast empire, expanded all throughout the Mediterranean area, Europe, down into Africa, over into the Middle East. And so these invaders came down, the Goths, Visigoths, Vandals, right, came down and they sacked Rome, and they kind of released the fall of the Roman Empire. And when that happens, even though these Goths, these Visigoths, these people are Christian, Arian Christian, but Christian, there is like a vacuum of power now, because there's a big question about, well, now that the empire is gone, who's in control? Well, all through these time between 315, when Christianity was made a legal religion, then became the state religion, and then over time was like given all these lands and kind of as like tithes and gifts and stuff. The church never really asked for any of these things. It was always kind of looked upon that the church would be, hey, we'll cover the spiritual realms. We're not rulers. We don't own anything. We're not here helping you guys figure out how to get closer to God and how to get to heaven. So then they started having these lands that were given to them, and maybe not necessarily run by the church, but at least given to them in name. And so when the Roman Empire fell, the biggest entity that actually owned land was the church. So, and usually the most educated people were the bishops and the priests. So we have this vacuum in the 8th century of all leadership is now gone. The secular authority is now put down. Who's in charge? And so the church, for good or bad, decided, well, we are here. We've been here. We'll take up the mantle until there's another secular authority that maybe comes about. And that's kind of the way it was until about Charlemagne. So we're talking about maybe 200 or 300 years of this going on. At which point there was these other kingdoms he's set up, still kept these church lands as a donation to the church, that's still in their name, they're still being run, they're still fueling the church and like taking care of their temporal needs. But no longer is there the authority, but there's still kind of this power surge between the royalty and the church. So, in other words, it was looked upon that these royals were also ordained by God to run these countries. Now, whether that's true or not, the church really never, gets involved with that stuff. All it really does is affirm that this person would be the king in a legal standpoint. And that basically came from lineage. So the church was kind of the one in charge of actually maintaining that lineage, saying, well, yeah, this person was really this, and this was a legal marriage, therefore this person actually is the... and that's really what canon law for the first few hundred years also was kind of like doing that too, is that, well, these lines of sanguinity and all this other stuff, a lot of that just is really, if you own land, who actually gets the land after the person dies, right? But there's still this kind of understanding, like, okay, well, even though I may be the king of France and all these monasteries and stuff are like in my jurisdiction, do I have some authority over them, right? And we just read, just like the Pope said, the Emperor. Well, no, these are sort of like embassies, right, in your country. They have their own autonomy, their own authority. So you don't really have much say in what goes on there because they have their own laws, their own structure, their own autonomy. Also, the other thing too is like during this power struggle within these between like the Dark Ages all the way through the Middle Ages, the centers of all these commerce and all these like industry, farming, were these monasteries that were set up all throughout Europe and around the Old Empire. So these monasteries were run by monks, right, brothers, sisters, right, and they would do their own farming. They would have their own schools, right, where they would teach people. And so these towns really built up around these monasteries and kind of were the center point for these big cities and these areas of these countries. So when a king was kind of established, the question was, okay, well, where's your boundary, right? What do you actually have authority over and what don't you? And of course, kings being kings, they always want more, so they're always trying to kind of like exert their authority over these church lands, which then leads to the Reformation, right? So the Reformation really wasn't necessarily a reformation of spiritual things. I mean, there were some spiritual things that were not being done and should have been done. It was really more a reformation of what is the role of the church and what should she do when it comes to these temporal issues. There was a lot of abuses going on. There was a lot of Lord bishops and Lord cardinals that actually did have lands because they were also royalty. They were handed down from their generation to generation, so the lines get even more murky. So who owes what, who has where, who has jurisdiction over what, how much should it be given over the church, how much is actually part of the secular authority. So it got very discombobulated. And so the Reformation was a catalyst to kind of make it more clear about what the role of the church was and what the role of the secular authority was. But all the time, the church has always maintained the separation between church and state. That's always been something that's been there since the very beginning. So then we flash forward then to the American Revolution, where you have this new kind of authority, this democracy, where we don't have a king, we don't really have a ruler. It's the people that run, right? And there's a big discussion, especially leading up to the American Revolution, especially even the founding of the New World. Well, okay, who actually gives the king their authority? Is it God, or is it the people that king rules, right? And that kind of fed this whole understanding of the New World, like how things are going to be run, who actually has the role. And that's what was the basis of the revolution. That the revolutionaries in the United States determined that God doesn't give the king the authority. We give the king the authority. And therefore, if we give it to the king, we can also take it from the king, right? And hence we have a revolution. So then the question is, well, where does the church fit into this, right? Because you always had the secular ruler, you had the church. So now you don't have a secular ruler. There's more of it's a democracy where you have multiple people rule. So how does what's the church role in that, right? How do they actually come in and what they do? And that's really a question that's still being asked today, right? If you think about it, I mean, the United States has only been around for 230 years, right? I'm sorry, 250 years. So, it's a big question because like the church has been around for 2,000. So compared to the church, the United States is a pup, is a kid, right? So the church does say though that the church should have some influence in the morals, the ethics of the people under her jurisdiction. But then how does that come into other thoughts, other religions? Should there be autonomy given to these other religions? And the church would say yes, there should be. But how do we influence, right? And I think it's really where we're at right now. Is it's not so much a question of who has authority. It's really more of a question since Vatican II: how does the church influence American thought, American ethic, American morals, and then also how well are we doing in that? So that's kind of the gist of when it comes down to the governments and whatnot. But yeah.
I think when you made the comment, it's the people that are setting the ruler,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I'm saying, and not God.
Yeah.
I think right there is a huge division.
Yeah.
And it's going to that
right.
a lot more.
Well,
getting away.
Well, and I think too, but even then, the founding fathers just so recognized that their authority came from God.
Right.
Yeah. So in other words, it's really kind of more a middleman. So it's not the God great to the ruler; it's God to the people to the ruler. Which, if you think about it in the hierarchy of the church, that makes a little more sense because the authority of a priest or a bishop is always used for the good of the lay people, right? And so it's really the lay people that are served in that respect. So really, the one being served has the authority, right? So there's an understanding there in the hierarchy of the church that kind of coincides with that. The church really never has ever said that God has ordained this person to be the king. All the church said, well, yeah, we can consecrate this person as a king and affirm that they're the king. But where the authority comes from, well,
right, it's still ultimately
right,
God.
ultimately God, right.
Although I think that God's being taken out of the picture within the government.
Yeah, I think nowadays you can definitely say that. But that's what I'm saying. But that's just really kind of a recent development. I mean, that really for the first, you can say, 150 years of the United States existence, God has always been a part of that understanding. What changed? Maybe we'll get that in a second. We can talk about that in 1 second. But maybe it's better to understand, well, when did the church actually have more clear understanding of their position in the American ideal? Or even, these other form of governments. So really, it wasn't until Rerum Novarum, which was written in 1891. So you're talking about, that was Pius. Right? Pius IX, so he wrote this encyclical, and really this was kind of a culmination of really the first time you really see a modern social ethic from the church, as far as how does the church work with these different governments? What is really kind of a good form of government? Where are the drawbacks of this one government? Where are there actually advantages? And really, what Pius was doing was kind of comparing this new kind of ideology that came out of Germany by this guy named Karl Marx, and was this idea of socialism. So you had on one side, you're saying, well, socialism, that's kind of like what Jesus was doing, or what the apostles were doing back in Acts, right? I mean, they lived in community, they didn't have any property, they shared it with everybody, and it was utopia. It was great, right? Everyone just did their own part, and no one actually worried about where food was going to come from. They all were given it. That seems like what Jesus wanted. Now, Karl Marx was an atheist, of course, so I mean that kind of, I don't think that was really in his field when he was writing his documentation, his manifesto. But there was something legit about that Pius wanted to look at and kind of compare. So you have this socialist understanding of government, where basically people are just kind of a cog in machine. They're just basically given a job, kind of work for the government, and the government provides them everything they need: housing, clothes, food, whatever. They need to actually do their job. Then you compare that to capitalism and the democratic understanding, where look, an individual is a person, right? We would say mainly is like this God, but there's a dignity in that person that also is kind of exhibited by what they do, their work. That the person is not what they do; they're not defined by that. But there's something that's gratifying, dignifying in the fact that they work and provide for their families, provide for their neighbors, provide for the people around them, and and actually have personal property that they can hand down to their children, their children's children, and kind of keep for themselves for their own betterment and enjoyment. So you have these two kind of conflicting ideologies going on in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And so Rerum Novarum was written to kind of get some clarity, at least maybe give some perspective on these different ideologies and look at some of the strong points and some maybe the things that were lacking. And the Pope kind of looks at both sides. He says, well, like, with Marxism or with socialism, communism at the time too. Yeah, there's this kind of shared society, and there's a good in that everything's being shared. That there's not no one's higher than another. Everyone's kind of equal, which is a good Christian value. However, one of the downsides of this ideology is that there's a reduction of the human person, just like to just be a machine, not really have their own dignity and respect, and also it's actually being forced into doing this charity and not actually given, right? So the problem with Marxism is that you don't necessarily have the option of giving to somebody else what they need. It's just done, right? Whether you want to or not. Is there a question about that?
No, I was thinking of Rerum Novarum. I mean, it was okay to have the wealthy, but the wealthy were still giving.
Right. Right. Yeah, and a lot of this was development like the Industrial Revolution and how these new inventions, they kind of come to the economy, and how does that affect people. So it just doesn't cover like government; it covers like just wage, right? What is a fair wage to give to a worker for the work they're doing, right? And how do these machines help with that? How do they hinder it? How are we supposed to understand it? But primarily, this is the first time we actually hear about something promulgated about this understanding of what these governments are, what the good in them are, and what maybe the drawbacks are. So that was one of the big drawbacks with communism, is that you lose your identity in a way as a child of God, as a person made in the image likeness of God. And also, you're forced into doing something, into giving charity, when that's not true charity, right? Now you compare capitalism and democracy with that. Is, well, you have a economy that is driven by, can be driven by profit, but should be driven also by human dignity as well. That there's a good in working, no matter what, whether you're a communist or whether you're democratic. But what is the purpose of work? Work is not just to drive the state. Work is to actually provide for the people that God gives you, right? To share with your neighbor, right? Provide means for a healthy, holy, happy life, right? And democracy does provide for that. That the fact you have personal property also gives the opportunity to share that property, right? So charity is primarily associated with democracy and capitalism. Now, there are drawbacks to that, though, right? Because profit can be the overarching goal, which basically takes your eyes off God as being the end. And then the question is, well, how much is enough, right? Once I have enough for my family and maybe my children's children, well, do I keep on storing up more just in case, right? There's maybe constant fear of, well, what happens if this happens? What happens if this happens? So there's detriments to that as well, to capitalism and democracy. But the main guiding principle that Pius and I kind of concludes on is, it seems that democracy and capitalism is a better form because it gives the individual autonomy and agency and the ability to actually make that choice between giving to my neighbor or not. Whereas with communism and socialism, you don't have that choice. You don't even provide for your family. The state is doing it. Your work is not actually going towards the betterment of them. It's just going to this entity that is kind of taking the place of God. But not only that, it takes away your choice, your autonomy, your agency. And so that's really the first time we kind of hear this understanding from the church, from the Pope, about autonomy on government, what their role is with the human person, and also like kind of the understanding of what work is and how work should be implemented into a Christian life. And then from then on, we kind of hear the same thing happen over and over again. After World War I, there's another kind of a deflation. There's kind of a rise in atheism from the horrors that we're seeing in the war. But again, you know, these concepts of narrow monarchy are kind of spreading and kind of propagate all the way to Vatican II and even beyond. So even today, we kind of still talk about that today. Like, what is a just wage, right? What does it mean to actually make a living that is fruitful and holy and healthy, and it can actually provide for families for the work they're doing? Primarily, that's driven by the market, right? The market decides, well, what is this work really worth? You know, is it the same worth where a janitor cleans up an office compared to a doctor performing open heart surgery, right? Is there a similar level of work, or is there some level of obviously there's some level of dignity involved with that basically that's up to the person to provide that dignity, right? Someone can be a very, very poor physician and a very, very good janitor, and they're actually one that maybe is more dignified than the other. But as far as the actual worth of the acts, well, that's kind of driven by the market itself. And the church will really say, well, we really have much to say in that. All we're saying is there should be an internal disposition, no matter what, that's dignified in order to what you're doing. But how much money you should make for that, well, that's not really up to the church to decide. And some would argue it's really not up to the government to decide either. Again, the church kind of stays away from that question. They're really more focused on how is this getting you closer to God? How is this good for your soul? How is this good for the people around you? How are you being dignified in these actions? Great. Any questions or comments? Like I don't know if anyone's online. I'm trying to see if we have one viewer. Beautiful. Okay. I don't know if YouTube is. Usually YouTube nobody's on there anyway. Let's see. Nope. All right. Well, I mean, if there are no other questions, or we have no one viewing else, that's okay too. I can go over to Sue's hand with the kids for another hour, so I'm good with that either way. Good. All right. Well, that does it for this month's Friendship and Faith. We'll be back next week with Bother the Father. So come on by, bring your topics, watch online. Look forward to seeing you. God bless.
I want to